American poet on the steps of the Capitol at the inauguration, stands up, delivers a poem that he's composed for the occasion. It's on TV. It has zero cultural impact on the American moment. Zero. And that is inconceivable back in the 11th century. Like, back in the 11th century, if you ask any random group of people, oh, what about, the poem that so-and-so recited on such and such a date, everybody would know. And everybody would be able to repeat it back to you. And again, all that tells us is that, just like, oh, that's just semantic, like word meanings and the status of poetry just have a very different kind of role in society, like a very different socio-political role to the role they have today. So I think what I'd like to do now is talk. Well, first I'll talk a little bit about something from the introduction, which is like so you're in the position I'm in as you're writing a book about the 11th century. You're looking for this question about ma'na. The question, it's a word that if you're doing first year Arabic, you've probably already come across it when you put your hand up and say ma ma'na chair in Arabic, or ma ma'na kitab. It's that word. It's the same word as if you listen to native speakers, and the kind of filler they use is ya'ni. Like مرة كنت أنا أعطي محاضرة وين كان San Francisco State كنت أقف قدام الطلاب It's that kind of filler. So it's this, and it's easy to think of it as meaning, but when you start looking at the work that it's doing in all these conversations, it starts to be clear that it's doing something a little bit more complicated than meaning. Because if you tried to write a book in English about meaning and how meaning meant meaning, it would be a little bit difficult and maybe not that fun and kind of vague, I think it's fair to say, without wishing to beat on English too much. But meaning in English is a bit of a fuzzy concept. And basically the argument that I'm making in the book is that ma'na in Arabic, especially in the 11th century, is not a fuzzy concept. It's a nice, clearly defined concept that does lots of interesting things in theology and poetics and logic. And so what I had to do in order to make this argument was read. And what this meant was that I didn't really have any option other than to read whole books, which meant that I couldn't really even read that many books, because these books are kind of long, and the professional pressure we're under means that we have to, we can't take 20 years to write our first book. We have to write our first book in 5 years or whatever it is. So writing this book, which is kind of this thick, meant I had to read maybe that much of books. And you get this moment where you realize that there's this, you get this feeling that all you've done is take a book and turn it into another book.
That much from the ground, or that much from...
No, from here, yeah. So
which ground?
So it's the Ibn Furak's Mujarrad Maqalat al-Ashari. Maybe that.
Right.
Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani's Asrar al-Balagha, Dalail al-Ijaz, الاعتقادات للراغب والذرية والتفصيل والرسائل. The first 7 chapters of Ibn Sina's Shifat, Yeah, it's about here. And this is like...
It's primary sources only, though.
Yeah, and this is printed on both sides of the paper. So the reason and one of the things that I came across when I was researching was there's this line that Giorgiani, the last person, the person who works on poetry, and this whole question of whether poetry is good or not, and what it means for poetry to be good or not, and how you can explain how a metaphor works. Like if you say Muhammad is a lion, what exactly do you mean? Like that he's actually a lion, or are you kind of relying on some idea of lions and bravery? Is it bravery? I mean, what words are you picking? What ideas are you picking out that go with lionness in your head that you're then applying to an actual person that you know doesn't have any of the claws and the yellow fur, but does have the bravery and the fearlessness? So that, and the word that Giorgiani uses to describe those little qualities that you're mapping in your head is ma'na. So ma'na is this tool that you can use to analyze how metaphors work. Giorgiani writes these two big books, and they get accused of being written like stream of consciousness. And Fakhruddin Razi, who's a hugely famous sort of 12th century Islamic scholar, says about Giorgiani and about these two books about poetry. ولكنه رحمه الله لكونه مستخرجا لأصول هذا العلم وأقسامه وشرائطه وأحكامه أحمل رعاية ترتيب الفصول والأبواب وأطنب في الكلام كل الإطناب. So he's saying Giorgiani, rahimahullah, because Giorgiani has already died by the time Razi is writing this, because he was bringing out the principles and divisions of this science, i.e. for the first time, like because he was creating a new science of what metaphor was, and because he was laying out its requirements and rules, he neglected to take care of arrangement into sections and chapters, and he also went on a great deal.
Yeah.
It was exceedingly prolific, went on and on and on and on. So Razi sees it as his job to be like, okay, it's work of genius, 2 long books, let me, Fakhruddin Razi, make it into something nice and organised. And it's kind of the same sort of thing that I'm doing. But there's a difference between what Fakhruddin Razi is doing and what I'm doing. So Fakhruddin Razi is taking the Arabic of about 100, 150 years before him, and he's turning it in, and he's rewriting it, and he's abbreviating it. And he's kind of identifying a structure behind this new science, a structure that Giorgiani didn't lay out in the same kind of like 1, 2, 3, 1.1, 1.2.1 kind of structure that Fakhruddin Razi uses. The reason Fakhruddin Razi does this is that he is producing books that have to work in educational institutions. Because the other thing that happens in the 11th century, like just after the people that I'm working on, is that the madrasa starts in the Islamic world. The madrasa, one of those few words that you learn in the first year of Arabic, and you suddenly realize that stuff you've been reading in papers about extremist madrasas in Pakistan is the word for school, and you're like... And you start to realize the deep Islamophobia that like underpins so much of the way people quote Arabic. the madrasa is this institution with a history that starts in the 11th century. Before the 11th century, there was a tremendous amount. There was just as much education and just as much scholarship and just as much money going into education. But there wasn't so much a set institutional, university-esque structure with students and professors and curriculum. So when you need curricula, you need textbooks. Textbooks to teach students have to be nicely organised. You can't afford to have what Giorgiani does and all this fun, like, stream of consciousness, probing of these big ideas. You need 1.1, 1.1.1, 1.1.2, so you can split it up and assign it to students. And that's what Fakhruddin al-Razi is doing. But he's working Arabic to Arabic. So if you look for a word like ma'na, the two things happen. Number one, you have to turn it into English, which is a problem, because meaning doesn't quite work, idea doesn't quite work, and you constantly worrying about whether you're managing to replicate the sort of role that ma'na plays in Arabic with the kind of role that you're using some new word in English. So I decided in the book I've started using content for ma'na, because you can say the content of someone's speech, and you can say the content of the chair is the plastic, or the red, the colour kind of, it's not red, it's kind of like, whatever colour that is, kind of like mauve maybe. You could say the mauve is like a content in the chair, maybe. And again, ma'na in Arabic is doing those things. You can say al-ma'na fi dhihni, there's a particular idea in my head, wa ma'na al-ahmar al-kursi. I don't know the Arabic for mauve.
Mauve.
Mauve. Ma'na al-mauve.
Ma'na al-mauve.
al-kursi. So then you have to kind of, yeah, so that's why I use the word content. So it becomes this question of, it becomes a question of translation, and it also becomes this question of, like, I'm focusing on something, this word ma'na, because I think it's really important, and I think that focusing on it really helps me to understand exactly what Ibn Furak was doing when he was talking about God or physics or God and physics, and what Giorgiani was doing when he was talking about metaphor and whether people really were lions or whether they were brave. So I think that if I focus on ma'na, I can work this out. But the people I'm reading, they never focused on ma'na. They never wrote chapters in their books on the ma'na of ma'na. Now that's not because they didn't care about what words meant, because if you remember, this is a situation where everyone cares deeply about what words meant and never stops talking about definitions and is always arguing about exactly what words are doing and exactly what words mean, and can we use it here or can we use it here? Is it appropriate for God? If we say mercy and we say God's mercy, does that mean that God's mercy is the same as my mercy if I'm merciful to my kids? Like, it kind of does, but then that would make me like God, which would be very theologically problematic. So there must be two meanings to mercy, but then how can there be two meanings to mercy when it's a word that we use? Like, this is the kind of thing that people are struggling with. But they never struggled with ma'na. So it's like, I think in the end, and I do a lot of, has anyone come across Wittgenstein at any point in college? So one has to pull on theory, and one is employed as a professor. But there's this German guy who lives in England for a period in the 20th century, who had all these ideas about how language works. And I thought he was I found him pretty useful. Because he has this thing, he's like, there aren't any what really matters, like the only thing, if you're looking at language and philosophy, the only thing you can really pull it down to is like the games people play with language. So it's all about language games. Like the only way you can really work out what stuff is by looking at how it gets bounced about between people. And he has this big analogy, like look, if you think of a group of people on a field and they're throwing a ball to one another, and at one point they're kind of playing something like baseball, and then maybe a bit later they're playing something a bit like American football, and then they're just throwing it, and then they throw it on the ground and they pick it up again. They're still playing a ball game the whole time. And if you're an alien, you could come in and look at them and say, oh, they're playing a ball game. And it makes sense. Like there are rules, there are stuff you can't do. Like you can't eat the ball, because that would be weird. So there's a rule. But you can do different things with the ball. And like that's the analogy to how people play with language. So for me, in this book, it's not just translation, it's the fact that Matana is like the ball, and these four people, Ibn Furak, Avicenna, Giorgiani, and Raghib, they're the people who are like throwing this ball Matana about. And the fact that they're using it in different ways is okay, because I can still look at it from the outside and say, Matana is like, there are rules to this game, it's being used in particular ways. So it's like I'm the alien, and they're playing the game. They know what they're doing the whole time. Like, there's no question that they're not confused about what they're doing with Matana. There's no sense in which they're like getting it wrong, or being vague, or being like contradictory. It's just, and you have to recognize that they're not getting it wrong and they're not confused, and then you have to stand back and work out what the rules are when you don't have a word in your own language, English, that plays the same game. And that's pretty much it. I spent hundreds of pages working through this. So yeah, I'd be happy to entertain any questions of any sort whatsoever, from the most basic to the.
So Matana is like word concept.
Yes.
Moving my head. Okay.
Yeah, I thought about concept.
Okay. Syntax, like how you can place different words to like semi-different intents. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So on the one hand, it works like concept in the same way. And exactly like you said, it's central to syntax. Like Giorgiani has an account of why the Quran is so eloquent and why poetry is so good that relies largely on syntax, and he uses Matana to explain how syntax works. And it's also the word, it's not the intent, it's the stuff you intend. So there's a word for intent, qasd, but the stuff you intend is always Matana. And you want to get it from your head into someone else's head. So far so good. And this, you could almost get away with idea, but it's a bit vague. Certainly concept is good. The problem is that people like Ibn Furak and lots of people who are working in theology, and people like Avicenna who are working in logic, say that things have Matana. So when we look at them, physical attributes and qualities of things, that's Matana as well. And God has Matana, like God's mercy or God's power or God's knowledge. And that's the same, and so God has a Matana of knowledge in the same way as a chair has a Matana of redness. And that's when you kind of run out of English analogues.
Yeah.
We don't really have
That's
a word
when
that
it gets
that.
really complicated, because when you talk about God's mana, I mean, it is mana that or mana zaval. And then you're into a situation where is this the essence of mana or is the essence of attributes? Because in Arabic, the God as attribute is different from God as essence. And people have been killed on that.
Yeah.
As Dr. Key has been saying, I mean, to believe, for instance, that justice is essence is essence of God, or is it an attribute of God? And the fact that God is essence is already very, very highly problematic. And it's a very difficult topic, yet Dr. Key has, somehow navigated us through these complexities that we have been witnessing, and especially with Al-Jurjani, who he talked about the two great books that Al-Jurjani wrote, and I think that all of us Arabists would have to read these books. I don't think your understanding of that tradition is complete without reading Dalal al-I'jaz and Asrar al-Balagha. But there's also an ideology. Dalal al-I'jaz, I think, has been translated as, I don't know, but it's basically evidence of inimitability of the Quran. And Asrar al-Balagha is a secret of rhetoric. And Al-Jurjani, back to your point, he uses syntax actually to arrive at ma'na, because he corners ma'na in the relationship between words, which is basically the composition of sentences. And in that way, he's also responding to an ideology at the time. And I don't want to go that deeper into the Mu'tazilite thought of Al-Jahid, who we used to critique as Ashab al-Lafz, those people who only care about the word in itself, as if the word in itself is not significant enough. The word is never in itself. This I think was it Bakhtin who said, if you a word in a dictionary is not yours. And a word, and when you use it as an adjective, is never yours. But when you start using it in a sentence, then it becomes yours. You claim it. But ma'na is complex, because ma'na, and I want to actually ask the question to Dr. Key. The Arabs have a famous saying. It's al-ma'na fi batn al-sha'ir, which really means that the meaning is in the guts of the belly of the poet. That you will never know what the meaning is, because you're not me. So meaning is not just significations, it's also intention through an utterance, right? So how is our work, approximating or getting to 100 or maybe 95% accuracy of really, really dwelling on that ma'na that the 11th century, men of letters and writings have been exposed to? I think this is, so where do we go from there?
Yeah, I guess the thing I would draw on is the Arabic. So the Arabic word for eloquence, balagha, is a word. Is usually eloquence is a good translation of it. But it originally used to mean, the verb is yablahu, and the sense is it's getting something across to someone. So the whole idea and the whole history of eloquence isn't. God, what's the etymology of eloquent in English? I have no idea.
From Locke, loquacious.
Oh yeah, like speaking a lot. Yeah, from like speaking a lot. Perfect. In Arabic, it's not from speaking a lot. It's from getting your point across. Like, you could translate balagha as effective communication.
Achievement.
Achievement, getting your intent into your speaker's mind. Yeah. So it's like the two, and this is very kind of typical of this culture, is that you have two competing encapsulations of a problem that have opposite conclusions. The ma'na fi batn al-sha'ir, you can't get at it, it's in the poet, you'll never get it out. And eloquence is effective communication. Because poets are eloquent, so that must mean poets get their ideas across. But poets don't get their ideas across, because the ma'na is still in their stomach. And Arabic, this is like a culture, like just like Ibn Furak was arguing about exactly what to call God and how to call God, and Jurjani was arguing about exactly what a metaphor was. It's a culture that then encapsulates these long disagreements in these little slogans, and then argues about them.
Wonderful. Any questions? More questions?
I have a question. So I'm kind of new to all this Arabic theory. Like, I had no idea. I just came for the curiosity. So I was like trying to keep up with you, and I was just like curious, like how'd you get interested in this topic, like, and what showed you to like write this? Well, like, yeah, how'd you get interested? Yeah, pretty much. I'm trying to, yeah.
I mean, it's a long and not very glorious story. I mean, I was 17. You have to, like, in England, you have to you have to, like, sign up for a list of the universities you're going to go to before you get your equivalent of your SATs, or A-level results. You have to apply to, like, 6 universities. And I had this big plan. I was going to go and do history and politics at Durham. It was all set. I like politics, like history. And I didn't get into Durham. And then I got better grades than they thought I was going to get, and I'd put St Andrews down on my application as like, I'm never going to get those grades. And at St Andrews I wanted to do IR, International Relations. Like, who doesn't? See the world, politics. But then you had to do a language with IR. And I wasn't going there anyway, so I'm like flicking through the brochure. It's 1997, 1996, no one cares about Arabic, it's not like a thing. And I picked Arabic, why not? There was like a nice picture, someone in the desert. I'm going there anyway. It's not bad. And then I don't get into Durham. I get good grades. I go to St Andrews. I'm in first year Arabic, like first week of college. I just stayed in it. Then I went there the summer after. I went to Palestine the summer after sophomore year. I went back to Lebanon the summer after junior year. Went back there. I got a job there. Got an internship there. Got a job there. Got a chance to go and do a PhD. It was all Just picked old Arabic because when I got the PhD, when I was applying for grad school, it was 2004, and I wanted to do the old stuff, like the fun stuff, the glory days, because I'd been living in Palestine for 4 years and things were pretty grim. I didn't want to study like modern Middle Eastern politics. So I picked the old fun stuff, and then you get locked in, and then you do a 7-year PhD, and then you have to get a job, and then you get a job, and now here I am. There's no way out.
So all this because of that picture of the man in the desert.
It's kind of true. It's kind of true. I'm not complaining. And then this, like the whole Matana thing, like you're at grad school, you have to pick, you do like 2 years of coursework, then you have to pick what am I going to write my dissertation on. Dissertation's like a book. It's got to be big. You've got to make a good choice. And I was going to do Raghib, and I was going to do his idea of like reason and revelation. You know, how like there's reason and there's revelation and then mutually dependent. So it's really important, the Enlightenment, Europe, Middle East. And then I start reading Raghib, and I realized that, he says that, but it's not a big deal for him. It's not like a central thing. He says it, it's true, great. It's just like a slogan. But what was really interesting was how he was using language. And then I started looking at how he used language, and then I did this dissertation on Raghib and language. And then when it was time to write a book, I was like, well, I have these ideas about language, now I want to test them on some of the big famous people. Giorgiani, who's so famous that, as Mohammed rightly says, everybody should read it. And Messina, who's so famous that 3 people in the room have heard of him. So I'm like, let me test this theory by like reading these big famous people. And that's it.
Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. And one of the achievements of Dr. Keyes, and there are many, is that the Arabic is a very difficult language, and I know that some of you are in one of you, so I see familiar faces in my class. And how do you reach the end? Even if you're studying a difficult language like Chinese or Japanese, they're category 4 languages. I mean, it takes 5 years to be comfortably in an intermediate level. But for Dr. Key to be a non-native speaker of Arabic, to be born in a completely different culture, and to pick up a language, not based on a desert or something like that. I'm sure he was just using it. But I'm sure that there's something curious about the language because it has a great history. Isfahani's Al-Aghani and Arabian Nights, and something that you really want to know about the culture other than just it being mediated to you. And that becomes the first, like trickling of interest that you would have in the language, whatever that language is. And then before you know it, it opens a window to the entire culture. And then he doesn't stop there. He goes to the difficult world of the proud and the few and the underpaid. He goes deep down into the tradition where very few people in the world know of. So this is beyond even being an Arabist. This is the core of the core of Arabic
Core.
studies, and you know, so that we are, and this is impressive. This is beyond. I mean, it's hard